What is up, guys? Today we're going to be tier listing every single deck for the Pokemon World Championships and seeing how they fare. Let's get started. Alright, so let's start ourselves off with Team Rocket's Mewtwo. I think we should put Team Rocket's Mewtwo easily into C tier. It has a lot of good qualities. For example, it's one of the only decks in format that can consistently beat Dragapult. However, it does have many drags. For example, it is very, very inconsistent in comparison to other decks that also have good Dragapult matchups. Alright, next up we have Hopp's Trevenant. I'm just going to go ahead and put this in Don't Play This tier. Sure, it did win the special event in Turin, but I just don't think this deck has enough potential or power to win Worlds or even do well at Worlds again. The only reason it really won was because people didn't know how to play against it. Now that it's won a special event, people are going to have at least tested a couple games against it, which is all they really need to figure out the matchup. Alright, next up we have Team Rocket's Honchkrow. I'm going to put this deck in B tier. I'm very optimistic about this deck. Its only drag is that it's slightly inconsistent. Otherwise, it is more consistent than the other Team Rocket engines, and it is very powerful as an attacker, beating almost every single Turbo 2-prize deck, and having an almost 50-50 matchup into Dragapult. Its inconsistencies, and its still slightly iffy Dragapult matchup, is what put it below the other decks. Next up, we have Zoroark EX. I'm going to go ahead and put this in A tier. And Zoroark EX is one of the most powerful decks in format. It is hyper-consistent, and it is able to hit high numbers that can kill Dragapults and even Excadrills. Now, Zoroark EX does have some downsides. For example, it cannot beat decks that play Grass Pokemon very easily. It's also very easy to tech for Zoroark. And even though its Dragapult matchup is pretty good, it's not 100%. Putting it not in S tier, but in A tier. Next up, we do have Ogerpon Clefairy. This is a tough one, but I'm going to have to put this behind Zoroark in A tier. I don't think this deck is good enough to win Worlds, and it does have some bad matchups. However, it does have a very consistent Pult matchup and very consistent Zoro matchup, where it can beat both of those very easily, making it a very good deck. However, it does have weaknesses into other decks like Excadrill and basically every single one-prize deck. During your Worlds run, you are pretty much guaranteed to hit 2 or 3 one-prize decks, making Clefairy Ogerpon not the most viable option. Next up, we have Beedrill. I think this deck belongs in Don't Play This tier, but I think this is the best deck in Don't Play This tier. Now, the reason I'm putting Beedrill in Don't Play This tier is because there are many other grass decks that do very similar things to Beedrill, but just have more power and are more consistent and are really better in every single aspect. I do think firmly that if you want to play the game for fun, Beedrill is the best for fun deck exclusively in format. However, I do not think it's made for the competitive format. Next up, we have Greninja. I'm going to put this in Don't Play This tier. Greninja is a fun deck. It's not even very fun, to be honest. It's a fun deck, but it's not the most fun deck you could play. And it's also just, in every aspect, an inferior Dragapult. Sure, you can chain them, maybe get multiple a turn, but it's just much more inconsistent. It doesn't have Dracloaks, which is a very important factor, and it hasn't seen results. Honestly, even though it did have a high percentage at New Orleans, I don't think it's going to have anything above a 2% at Worlds. And 2% is even a stretch, because everybody in the competitive community knows that this deck is just straight trash. Next up, we have Dragapult Blaziken. I'm going to go ahead and put this in S tier. I think this is the best Dragapult version right now. Blaziken is good into hammers, it's good into grass decks, and most importantly, it's good into Excadrill, which is really high percentage right now. It also is, not the most consistent Dragapult version, which is why it hasn't been performing or even been played by very good players. Jackson Ford has seen a lot of success with the deck, with multiple top 16s and a top 8. However, I do think this deck does have potential to maybe win Worlds. Our next deck is going to be Pult Noir. I'm also going to put this deck in S tier. I think that Dusknoir is a really, really good Pokemon. It can take out single prizes when you need to, and fix prize trades when you need to. It also provides a good damage buff into the mirror. However, I don't think this version is as good as Blaziken, because it's not as good into Excadrill. In the previous format where Excadrill did not exist, and Clefairy decks were very low percentage, I do think that Dusknoir was a lot better. However, in this next Pitch Black format, I think Blaziken is going to rule over all the other Dragapult variants. Next up is Pult Hammers. I'm going to get some hate for this, but I'm going to go ahead and put this deck behind Zoroark in A tier. I think Hammers had its time to shine. It won the Los Angeles Regionals, and it's performed very consistently since then. However, it has been outshined by Dragapult Dusknoir with Hammers, making it the purely worse version of Dragapult. Sure, it's slightly more consistent, but still, Crushing Hammers are a 50-50 coin flip. Basing your deck on a 50-50 coin flip with some extra consistency isn't always going to win you games. I do think it did back when Excadrill wasn't in format, back when Blaziken wasn't the best Dragapult variant and as much played. But with Crushing Hammers in format, I don't think that they're going to be as good into Blaziken and Excadrill, which are two of the highest percentage decks at the moment. Next up, we have Crustle. I'm going to put this deck in high B tier. Crustle is a very good deck, having good matchups into all slot boxes, all Raging Bolts, all Zoroarks, and pretty much all Pult versions. However, it is very easy to tech for Crustle when it's on your radar. For example, all you have to do is tech in one high HP single prize Pokemon into your deck, and you're pretty much guaranteed to beat Crustle. Also, almost all Fire-type decks can beat Crustle, as well as Excadrill. Excadrill's Metagross can very easily beat Crustle. Crustle 2-shots Excadrill, and Excadrill 1-shots Crustle, meaning that Excadrill very easily wins the prize trade, making Crustle not as good into the format. Next up, we do have Typhlosion. I'm going to put this above Trevenant in the don't play this tier. I would not play this deck to Worlds. I think that some players have seen success with this deck, for example, Liam Stunts. However, I don't think Typhlosion has what it takes to win Worlds. It is inferior to a lot of different decks in a lot of different ways, in almost every aspect. I just don't think this deck has what it takes to perform at any event coming soon. Maybe post-rotation that'll change, but I just don't think it does. Our next deck is going to be Cynthia's Garchomp, another deck that loses to Crustle almost every time. I am going to have to put this deck in high B tier. It has bad matchups into grass decks. It doesn't have a 100% matchup into Pult. However, with Pult Hammers losing speed and losing percentage points, this deck really does have more time to shine. One of my good friends did perform really well at a recent tournament with this deck. Caden placed in the top 32 at NAIC with Garchomp. I think his 60 is really good. However, I do think all Garchomp builds are weak into Crushing Hammers. And as long as Crushing Hammer is decreasing in percentage, I think Garchomp has what it takes to truly top 8 or even win Worlds in certain divisions. Next up, we have Grimmsnarl. Azul GG just won a really big online tournament with Grimmsnarl. That's why its percentage points online have increased so much in the last week. However, I don't think this deck is perfect, so I'm going to have to put this deck in a high B tier. I think Grimmsnarl has a lot of good matchups and a lot of bad matchups. It doesn't necessarily win the Pult Noir matchup. It doesn't necessarily win the Slot Box matchup. It definitely loses to Crustle, and it definitely loses to Honchkrow. This deck has a lot of good and bad matchups, and a lot of 50-50 matchups, for example, almost every Pult variant. This deck has a lot of potential, but I don't think it's good enough to win Worlds. I would not play it to Worlds if I were you, purely for the reason that I don't think it's good enough right now. I think post-rotation, it can see some real success with the new Gwyn engine. However, right now, the format is just not stacked up to handle Grimmsnarl. Next up, we have Kangboof. A lot of senior division players did see success with Kangboof. However, I am going to have to put this deck in low C tier. I think this deck has a lot of potential. It beats Dragapult in a lot of different scenarios, and it beats a lot of different decks. However, I don't think it has what it takes to do well at Worlds. It pretty much just loses to high output damage for little energies. The picture-perfect example of that is Zoroark, is Garchomp, and is Lucario. And as long as Kangaskhan Bouffalon cannot handle those two decks, or those three decks, I don't think it has what it takes to even do well at Worlds. It also doesn't have the best matchup into Festival Lead, which is another deck that I'm going to be pulling up right now, and I'm going to be putting Festival Lead in the top spot in A tier. To be honest, I was very skeptical of this deck when it won the tournament in Malaysia recently. However, after playing this deck a little bit, after building it myself, and after testing it out on ladder, I do think this deck has what it takes to win the World Championships. It has a very, very consistent engine, a 50-50 Dragapult matchup, and a very, very good matchup spread all around. Grass typing is a very good typing to have because it beats Zoroark, Grimmsnarl, and most of all ground types. For this reason, I think it has what it takes to win Worlds. However, it does lose to Dragapult Dusknoir. And as long as Dragapult Blaziken is gaining percentage points and Dragapult Dusknoir is losing percentage points, I think that Dipplin, or Festival Lead in general, has what it takes to win the World Championships. Next up, we have Alakazam. I'm going to put this deck in low B tier, or even... This is rough, but I'm going to have to put it in mid B tier. I think Alakazam has what it takes to do really well at Worlds. However, I do think it still loses to Disruption, even with the new Toucannon card. Now, this deck does have a lot of upsides. It's very consistent, it's very easy to draw cards with, and you're almost always setting up. However, after you set up, in the late game is when the real fight starts, with consistency. This deck's late game consistency is atrocious after you get disrupted. After you get unfair stamped, red carded, judged, whatever. Almost every single deck is playing one disruption card in format right now, with the exception of Excadrill. Now, for this reason, it does have a very good Excadrill matchup. However, every single Pult matchup, it is a 50-50, because it's either you draw well off Disruption or you don't. If you do draw well off Disruption, you win the game. If you don't, you have a very, very rough time ahead of you, which is why I would not recommend that you play it to Worlds. The next deck, I might be slightly biased because I'm a huge Riolu fan, but I think Lucario belongs in low A tier. It might also belong in high B tier, but I think this Lucario deck has what it takes. There are multiple different versions of Lucario, with Hariyama to Dunsparce and recently Austin Charles' Togekiss build. I think these decks have what it takes to do well at Worlds. Jones Diaz is the most successful Hariyama player, and Nikolai Steinborg is the most successful Dunsparce player. Austin Charles is the most successful Togekiss player. They've all seen success with Lucario purely because it's a deck that they love, not because it's the best positioned in format. I think that these players have what it takes to do well at Worlds, not because the deck is well positioned, but because the deck is really, really fun and really, really boring. Now, I did recently read an article by SmartTCG where he states that the deck is really boring, yet really good. It's really well positioned in the format because it can beat Blaziken really easily. Having the same HP and the same ability to buff damage as Excadrill, and also being able to beat Blaziken, is a huge buff for the deck. The only issue for it right now is that Clefairy is really high percentage. There are random Clefairies thrown all over the place, in Slot Box and Pult Blaziken. If your opponent gets a Clefairy online when you have a Lucario inactive, they can one-shot your Lucario really easily, and eventually trade favorably. This is why Lucario is not much better. In fact, I'm actually going to put it in high B tier, because I don't think it has what it takes to win Worlds. However, I think it has what it takes to do well. Next up, we have Absol Kangaskhan. Recently, this deck has seen some success in the hands of Joseph Berg, who got top 256 at NAIC, and by Tim Danklin, who made a video showcasing this card and winning an online tournament with it. I do think If we're talking about Joseph Barrow's list, I don't think it has what it takes to win Worlds anymore. However, I think Tim Franklin's version of the deck can easily be put in the top of B tier. I think the Janine Secret Art version of the deck has what it takes to top 8 Worlds. For the reason being, it has a really good matchup spread, and it's not very well known at the moment, meaning people aren't going to be testing against it, and it has a good matchup spread. So, essentially, you're beating Polt because they don't know what to do, and even if they do know what to do, it's still a 50-50. So that's why I think this deck needs to do well. Just a little sidebar. I think for a deck to do well, it has to have a good Dragapult, which is why a lot of these decks in Don't Play This tier are in Don't Play This tier. Beedrill, Greninja, Typhlosion, and Trevenant, none of them have a perfect Dragapult matchup. If one of them did have a good Dragapult matchup, they might go into C tier, like Team Rocket's Mewtwo or Kangaskhan Buffalant. The decks in B tier all have a good Dragapult matchup, or at least a 50-50, same with A tier and S tier. Dragapult is not possible to have more than a 50-50 matchup without having sucky other matchups. And for that reason, I believe that every single deck above C tier has to have a good Dragapult. Now, our next deck is going to be Toxbox. I don't know why they put Absol on this logo, because this deck is more Toxtricity, like Chi-Yu and Brute Bonnet, than Absol at the moment. However, I do think I'm going to have to put this deck in C tier. It doesn't have a very consistent Dragapult matchup, which already puts it down a few points. However, I do think this deck has the potential to do well. It's not going to do well at Worlds because players know how to play around it, and it just isn't very good in comparison to other decks that people could play. However, I think this deck has potential, and when somebody cracks a list, I think that this deck could do well. Our next deck is going to be Hide and Seek. Easily the most anticipated deck from the Pitch Black format. I don't think it lived up to its expectation. A lot of the Japanese players were putting this in high A tier or high S tier. But with Festival Lead gaining a lot of percentage points, I do think I'm going to have to put Dhelmise Hide and Seek in mid B tier. It has a good Dragapult matchup to a certain extent. It doesn't have a particularly good Dragapult Dusknoir matchup or Dragapult Hamers matchup. However, or even for that matter, Dragapult Blaziken. I do think it has the worst Dragapult Blaziken matchup. For this reason, it has to go in B tier. With Dragapult Blaziken easily being the best Dragapult version, it's impossible to have a bad Dragapult Blaziken matchup, even though you have a good matchup into everything else. Next deck we have is Excadrill. I'm going to put this deck in S tier, just below Dragapult Blaziken. This is a hot take. I've not seen a lot of people putting Excadrill in S tier. I do have a lot of opinions about this deck. I have put in a lot of games with it, and I think it's very reasonably able to win every single matchup on this board. Except for maybe Typhlosion, but we don't talk about that. But Excadrill is a really good deck. It can hit really high numbers into Dragapult, making it really favored there. Its only issue would be single prize decks, like Dhelmise, like Festival Lead, like Alakazam, like Honchkrow. Honchkrow, it does have a winnable matchup because you can just use the first attack a lot in the early game, meaning that you might be able to just slowly run them out of cards, or even lower their consistency even more than it already is. And to Dhelmise, there are certain lines that you can take to win the matchup, for example, leading with Genesect. Into decks like Festival Lead, you also have lines with Genesect. However, there are also many tech cards that you can include for the Festival Lead matchup. One of the more funny ones that I've seen is the Orthworm EX, which bounces damage back when it gets attacked. However, I do think Handheld Fan and Fluttermane are picking up percentage points online, which is making this deck much better into the matchup. The only other deck that it would have a bad matchup into is Alakazam. And Slowking, I guess, but we can talk about Slowking later because all you need to do to fix that matchup is have a Shaman on board. But for Alakazam, all you need to do is play a special red card, and that matchup is basically fixed. Because any deck that plays a special red card is essentially 50-50 into Alakazam. Now next up is Lopunny. I'm just going to go ahead and put this in low C tier. This deck had a hard enough time into Dragapult when it played Unfair Stamp and Special Red card was not released. This deck is really, really weak to Watchtower Disruption. As long as you can get Watchtower Disruption online, you pretty much win the matchup. A lot of people didn't realize this when they were playing the deck originally. Now, this deck was very low percentage when it won a regional, which is why it probably won the regional. As soon as people identified this deck's weaknesses, it got a huge target on its back and immediately lost a lot of percentage, because people realized they can't win as long as people know how to play against it. Our next deck is Starmie. This is another deck that, a lot like Typhlosion, was played to some success by Liam Stunts. Shout out to Liam Stunts, he's the GOAT. But, I do think this deck belongs in high C tier. It doesn't always win Dragapult, which really sucks. It's always weak to Shaman, which really sucks. It doesn't really win single prize or double prize matchups a lot of the time, which really sucks. Essentially, this deck just has a bad matchup into pretty much everything. You can disagree with me in the comments below, but I just don't think this deck has what it takes to win a game, let alone Worlds. Next up, actually, for that reason, I'm just going to put this in the bottom of Don't Play This tier. Next up is Hydrapple. This saw a lot of percentage points at NAIC. However, like Greninja, I think it was only because it's a fun deck and easy to play, with cards being very easy to source. I do think I am going to have to put this deck in high B tier, the top of B tier. It's a grass deck that plays Dipplin. Does that sound familiar? Yes, because that's what Festival Lead plays. In almost every single way, this deck is either an inferior Festival Lead or an inferior Slot Box. For that reason, I think it belongs in high B tier. It's still able to win games, but there are other versions with the similar engines that have a much better matchup spread. Next up, we have Slowking. I'm going to go ahead and put this deck at the top of A tier, even above Festival Elite. I do think this deck has what it takes to win Worlds in Juniors or Seniors Division. I don't think it has what it takes to win Worlds in Masters Division. It doesn't have a very good Festival Lead matchup because they play both Shaman and they play Rabsca. Neither of those cards are particularly bad into Slowking. Actually, they're very good into Slowking. They're specifically for Slowking. So, for those reasons, I think Slowking just loses Festival Lead. It pretty much also loses to a lot of decks that play Shaman, or at least has a much harder time. And it does have a much harder time into a lot of different single prize matchups. However, I still think it has what it takes to win in the Juniors and Seniors Division because of much higher Pult numbers and much lower Dipplin numbers. It also definitely has a very favorable Excadrill matchup. Excadrill needs to play Shaman, pretty much, to win the matchup. I've done a lot of testing, don't question me on it. You need Shaman. For this reason, I think you either play against Shaman or you win the game. That's essentially the themes that I've been seeing. You can definitely disagree with me in the comments, but I just don't think this deck is particularly amazing into Shaman. Which is why it's not an S tier. Otherwise, power levels and consistency are off the charts. I think this deck is one of the most powerful decks in format. The only thing holding it back is Shaman and other Slowking techs, which are very prevalent right now. One of the last decks that we have right now, and probably the only serious deck that we have left, is Raging Bolt EX. I think this deck belongs in high B tier. It has a pretty good Dragapult matchup. Or you know what? I'm going to go ahead and put this in low A tier. I think this deck has such a good Dragapult matchup that it is insane. I think that this deck loses to Moltres, but since Moltres is losing percentage points, this deck has its time to shine. You know what? I'm going to even slip it above Slotbox. Why is that? Because Slotbox loses to Pult Blaziken. Raging Bolt OHKOs Blaziken. For this reason, it is purely a better slot box at the moment, which is why I think this deck has what it takes to win the World Championships, in maybe the Juniors or Seniors Division. Next up, we have Terrabox with Noctowl. I'm going to go ahead and put this in Don't Play This tier. I'm not even going to elaborate on that. It's just a bad slot box, just a bad Raging Bolt. Noctowls don't improve consistency that much. It is just bad. I'm putting this in Don't Play This tier. Don't question me on it. I don't want to see any comments about it. It is just a bad deck right now. And lastly is Toucannon. Now, I have very mixed feelings about this deck. The Cornerstone version that just recently dropped seems really good. but I haven't had any time to test it so far. I'm going to put it in high C tier just because potential seems very high for it. However, I don't think it has what it takes to win Worlds, and I don't think you should play it. I will test it, though, and get back to you. So that is our Pitch Black Worlds tier list. If you have any questions or comments or concerns about my tier list, make sure to drop them in the comments. Make sure to drop a follow. Make sure to drop a like. It really helps support the channel. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in another video.